Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Iran, the suspect nuclear weapons program in the Tehran regime's underground caverns. That is the question since November 23rd at Geneva, the interim agreement. What is to be done? The Obama administration believes negotiation and conciliation and very careful language over these next weeks will lead to a 6-month period, a tryout. There are other ideas in the United States Congress. This is a government with 3 parts, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. Right now, we're very pleased to turn to news of the day from the legislative branch. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, joins me. Malcolm, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
The word is sabotage, Malcolm. The word sabotage being used by friends of the administration directed against members of Congress who do not believe that lifting or suspending or ignoring the sanctions regime is the best way forward with Iran. Have I said it correctly, Malcolm?
You have, but to add that the leaders of the effort are Democrats, Menendez, Schumer, who have been out front, courageously standing up on this issue, as is our guest tonight, as our guest has been, that this is, I think, a clarion call and a moral call to say that we're not trying to interfere with the negotiations. This doesn't at all affect it any more than the sanctions announced last week by the administration. This says in 6 months they will take effect.
We welcome Ted Deutch, congressman from the 21st District of Florida. That includes parts of Palm Beach County and Broward County. Congressman, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. The administration is rattled enough to use the word veto. That is tough language when you're dealing with the legislative initiative from Congress. To your understanding right now, the sanctions regime has worked, and you've been part of it these last years and these last months. The administration position says that it works. So what is the concern by the administration if and when Congress goes ahead and passes sanctions that will not take effect unless the negotiations fail? Good evening.
John, how are you? And it's good to be with you, Malcolm. It's good to be with you as well. Let's just remember how we got to the place that we find ourselves in today, John. The reason that there are negotiations taking place at all, the reason that Rouhani was elected, that Rouhani was even permitted to run by the Ayatollahs, is that the sanctions that Congress has worked so hard to put into place have brought incredible pressure to bear on the regime. That's why we're even having negotiations. So at this point, the administration has acknowledged that the sanctions work. They've continued to impose sanctions. They designated a number of companies and individuals just last week under the existing sanctions regime, which the Iranians didn't like, but nevertheless are continuing. And all the Congress is trying to do, all the Senate is trying to do today is to move forward, to make clear, to add to the strength of the administration's hand, add to the strength of the P5+1's hand in their negotiations, the understanding on the part of the Iranians that if they're not serious about negotiating, then at some point in the future, after we've gone through these negotiations, if they've not been successful, then the additional sanctions will go into place. And that's what they're trying to do.
And like the legislation you helped lead in the House, which was passed already, and together with the Chairman Royce and Elliot Engel and others, you provided the same flexibility. I mean, this does not put a roadblock. The opposite. This gives the administration additional leverage, it would seem, and it calls for a final agreement that verifies the results in the termination of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Well, I think given the statements we hear from Iranian leaders that they can get to 20% in 24 hours, they can do all the things to sabotage the deal, it seems that this kind of a statement can reinforce the P5+1's position.
Right, and let's remember, we've been told that the P5+1 needs space to negotiate. And we've been told that Congress shouldn't do anything that would so enrage the Iranians that they would walk away from the talks. The only reason they're in the talks is because of the sanctions, and no one has suggested, though it might make good sense, No one has suggested that the United States and our allies walk away from the talks when tens of thousands of Iranians march in the streets screaming death to America. That certainly calls into question the Iranian commitment to this effort, but we all prefer to see a diplomatic solution. Nobody wants to see a war if it can be avoided, and that's why we need to continue to forge ahead.
Can I ask, on Geneva 2, the Syrian talks, the reports are that it's in complete disarray. What is your sense of what is happening?
And why this is important is that Syrian civil war, where at least 100,000 dead and millions of refugees, the Syrian civil war is tied intimately to Tehran. The expectation is that Tehran controls the Damascus regime. Please continue, Congressman.
Well, that's exactly right, John, and it's the Iranian regime that continues to prop up Assad's regime. It's the efforts that Iran continues to undertake there, and the concern is, I mean, we're at a very precarious moment. There are over 125 or 130,000 people who have been killed. If nothing is done to provide a humanitarian corridor to get aid in this winter, 10,000 more people or more will also die. And it's a difficult situation. I've said this repeatedly. It's tough. That doesn't mean that we can simply walk away from what's happening in Syria and leave it to the Iranians and the Russians to sort out. That would have a devastating impact. That result would have a devastating impact on our own national security.
Congressman, I ask about that tough word, veto. In the House of Representatives, I remember speaking to one of your colleagues several weeks ago, Peter King of New York, and he believed there were well over 300 votes in favor of the Iran sanctions, of additional Iran sanctions, pending the failure of negotiations. Do you believe that's true today? More than 300 votes in favor of the sanctions?
I don't know what the actual number is. I think what's important, I think what my colleagues realize is that all of this talk that suggests if you want to try, that attempts to try to strengthen the hands of our negotiators by setting some date upon which further sanctions will go into place. If you support those efforts, what you're doing is supporting diplomacy, and those who try to characterize it as something other, those who suggest that it somehow advocates for war, just simply aren't being honest in their assessment. And given that, there's a very sizable number of members who absolutely would support the efforts not to impose additional sanctions today. And the fact is, the administration is doing that already under existing sanctions law because they understand that that's the right thing to do. It's simply to make clear what's going to happen if the Iranians are not serious about doing what they committed to do in November.
And that is true also of the legislation you introduced, and I saw
Correct.
that Ioanni and others praised it, and maybe you could explain to the audience what impact this will have where you force real SEC's disclosure from companies.
Iran Transparency and Accountability Act. Please continue, Congressman.
Sure. I mean, the language in that law at this point has required companies who do business in Iran to disclose in their SEC filings, any publicly traded company, to disclose the extent of their involvement in Iran. We want not just to rely upon the government, the administration, to sanction companies who violate existing law and do business there, but we want American investors to be able to determine whether the companies that they're investing in are putting their own interest in doing business in Iran ahead of our national security interests. And we've seen the reporting going exceedingly well. Now our efforts are focused on the SEC to make it easier for average investors to go to the SEC website and be able to find those companies' disclosure statements without having to press 8 or 10 different clicks to get to the right place. But we're seeing it have an impact, and it's the point here is that in any way that we can increase the pressure on companies and nations who do business in Iran, it increases the pressure on the Iranian regime and forces them to make the concessions that ultimately we're going to require in order for the nuclear program to.
Congressman Ted Deutch, 21, Florida, is serving his third term in the U.S. House of Representatives, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.